this episode, we'll trace the development of both the divine office and the Mass over 1,000 years, beginning with St. Gregory the Great in the 6th century and concluding with the reforms of the Council of Trent. We'll discuss how St. Gregory helped to shape the liturgical framework and preserved unity while allowing local traditions to thrive. Moving forward, we'll see how these traditions evolved, influencing lots of different rites across Europe. We're not used to thinking that lots of rites are good, but we'll see what was good about them. And why did these ultimately lead to the standardization by Pope St. Pius V, known as the Tridentine Mass? Join us as we journey through this intricate and fascinating liturgical history. On sspxpodcast.com/mass, you'll be able to find all of these episodes, videos, and resources. This is free to listen to, but please do consider a one-time or a small monthly recurring donation. Now let's join Father Jonathan Loop for Episode 11, What the Mass Looked Like in the Middle Ages. Father Loop, it is great to have you back, and geographically in a very different place from Post Falls.
That is very true.
Welcome to St. Mary's.
Thank you.
How are you liking it so far? You've been there, about a month or so?
That seems right. So far, I think it's been a very good introduction.
Good.
Yeah, I'm serving as a pastor, which involves a lot of involvement with the sacramental life here.
Mm-hmm.
So by way of example, I'm working with, I think, 10 marriages for the remainder of this year, and I've already got 15 scheduled for next year for May. By way of example. And then I'm also teaching in the college up here.
Okay, very good. How many parishioners are there in St. Mary's these days?
So, I'm still hearing some different numbers as far as the actual registered parishioners. I think it's probably in the order between 4,500 and 4,800 or thereabouts. Wow. Maybe getting a little bit close to 5,000.
Wow, that's crazy. Well, good luck. We'll pray for you.
Thank you.
And I don't mean that in any disrespect towards St. Mary's. It's just the sheer numbers. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of people to be a pastor of. Well, Father, today we're taking our second look at the history of the Mass. And I'm going to apologize in advance. I've had some dental work done, so if I'm stumbling over my words, it's going to be like this for a few episodes. Sorry.
See, at least you have an excuse. So
yeah. Well, or I could just be lying. So last episode with Father Sherry, we saw the very early beginnings of the Mass, what it looked like from apostolic times through the first few hundred years. What kind of period are we looking at now, Father?
Okay, so what we're going to try to do, small, easy task, is to look at a roughly 1,000-year period that we'll begin with a great saint, one of the great doctors of the church, St. Gregory the Great, and where we'll try to conclude more or less with St. Pius V, who more or less really brought to a completion some of the reforms that were undertaken at the Council of Trent. And part of the goal here is obviously to get some perspective by reviewing very briefly some of the elements of the history of the liturgy during that period, with respect to, say, the Mass, even in some measure the divine office, just to kind of have a beginning of a grasp of how it was treated by the Church, by Rome, and how that can give us some, let's say, ability to judge a little bit more with greater depth what's going on in our own time. Now, I think as a preliminary remark, I should be very clear that I am by no means an expert on this. I've been very interested in my studies for this. But one of the texts that I've kind of relied a little bit more on is a book by Dom Prosper Carolingian called Liturgical Institutions. And so it's the same author who is most famously connected with the liturgical year, which he composed primarily for popular devotion to kind of spread an understanding of the Mass, the cycle of the year, etc. But one thing to keep in mind about him is that he was actually a pretty major figure in a movement in France in particular in the mid-1800s to really bring back the church to the Roman liturgy, and especially in France, where you'd had some, at least recently, from his perspective, some deviations, some attempts to meddle with the liturgy that took it further afield from the Roman liturgy. It's the whole idea of that Gallicanism of that time period, which had its expression in the worship in these expressions, these rites that were foreign to the Roman rite. And yes, so it's a very interesting work. I actually, unfortunately, don't know that it's in English. It may very well be. I don't have that myself, but he goes through in some depth a lot of what occurs over those course of the years in that perspective, trying to help understand that, well, there's been a lot of different changes over the course of the years in the liturgy, some which were blessed by the church, many, of course, which were not. But always and ultimately, as his conclusion at the end of the book, is in the service of the faith, that unity of the faith.
Yeah. So liturgical innovation is nothing new. It was happening during his time, and certainly, as we're going to be seeing here during this period of about 1,000 years that we're looking at, it's going to be happening all throughout this period. So should we start with St. Gregory the Great? Is that where you want to kind of kick off this era? Yeah,
let's do that.
Okay.
And kind of as an ancillary point there, we're going to be focusing much more on the Western Church.
Right.
So we're not going to really try to delve into the Oriental rites, whether before or after the schism, which separated so many of those ancient churches from the unity of the true church. And partly because I just know very little of it. But even, it's just a lot of that initial work really, as we'll see with St. Gregory here, starts out from the understanding that not only, of course, is the Pope the head of the church as a whole, but he's also the chief of, let's say, Italy, as the primate of Italy, and then to speak very loosely, the patriarch of the West, the one who has a more, let's say, day-to-day supervision over the affairs of the church in those areas. Now, he, in his case, he's a Benedictine monk originally, and I'm certain that had a great influence on his love of the liturgy and his great care for it that he manifested. But he also had a kind of a diplomatic career prior to being elected to the papacy. He actually spent some time as a papal legate in Constantinople. So he had some familiarity with a wider church as well. But then he's elected to the papacy in the year 590, which is, let's say a little over 100 years after St. Benedict, roughly. And also pretty soon, historically speaking, after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, etc. So, you had a large social dissolution that had taken place over the previous few centuries that had not really found its full replacement yet. Okay, so you had a lot of barbarian kingdoms that kind of spring up to a greater or lesser extent in the remains of what was the Roman Empire. And partly because of that, there's a lot less, you have a kind of a growth of local expressions of the liturgy. You don't have the same security and travel and stuff like that. Now, so when he's elected, he does make it very much one of his priorities to try to, move in the direction of some greater unity in that worship. And that in a couple of ways. Firstly, by trying to actually collect and bring together in one volume, basically the prayers, the rites of, let's say, the Mass, both in itself and throughout the year. And that comes to be known. So I'm sure Father Sherry mentioned some of the previous sacramentaries. So one of the more famous ones was that of Gelasius, Sacramentary of Gelasius, which itself was a compilation of these prayers and stuff like that. So St. Gregory takes that and tries to corral it more effectively into one, we can call it a document, that can serve as the basis for the worship of the church. And at the same time, he, let's say, will add and revise some of those prayers. So, for example, some these liturgists, Dom Guéranger was commenting, some of these liturgists believe that he actually added a prayer or two to the canon, Diesque Nostri, so the one right before, more or less, the consecration. And at the same time, he also reordered a little bit. So, by way of example, bringing the Our Father right to the end of the canon, so where we now know of it. And he actually, in a letter that he writes to an archbishop in Sicily, justifying that, he's like, look, it doesn't make any sense that after the sacrifice has been completed, that we just have, say, the composition of some unknown expert, as opposed to the prayer that our Lord himself taught us. That seems to be most fitting. And that sacramentary that he compiles together with what's called an antiphonary, I maybe pronounced that wrong, actually. But anyways, that's a collection of a lot of the propers, for example, the introits, the graduals. So those two together, taken together, are the nucleus of what will be what we now know as the missal. Okay. And in many respects, effectively the same as what we have in our missal. There will be a few alterations, as we'll see, but the core and the essence, but particularly in the canon, is what we have.
I have a quick question. When he was doing this, was he intending on doing it for the entire Western Church as Patriarch of the Western Church, or was he doing this for specifically the Roman rite? Because at this time there were many rites, right, or right, several rites. Was he doing this to try to be kind of universal about it, or just for Rome?
So I would say both, in a manner of speaking. So firstly, more primarily, for Roman Italy. So he definitely imposed some of these codifications on the different dioceses in Italy, and required that they follow it. And of course, really try to give the best expression to the worship of God in this capital of the Christian world. At the same time, he certainly was very, let's say, happy to allow that to be made use of throughout, let's say, the Western Church, by which we can mean, let's say at the time, Spain, the Frankish kingdoms, and the Germanic kingdoms, England, which we'll see in a moment, etc. All those, in a way, he's quite content that they'd be taken, but he wasn't at this point intent on imposing the sacramentary on them. Right. And that'll become clear, actually, in a letter that he writes to St. Augustine, the Benedictine monk that he sends and makes Archbishop of Canterbury, so the first archbishop there, in which he actually responds to a question that St. Augustine asked. It's like, okay, look, as I was traveling to England, to Britain, I had to go through Gaul, and in so doing, I was exposed to a lot of these Gaulish rites, which are very different than the Roman as far as the order of things. One major difference in how they would approach it is that, for example, the offertory there in the Gallic rites would be done right at the beginning of the Mass, as opposed to where we're used to it after the teaching portion of the Mass of the catechumens, the creed, and then you have the offertory. For the Gauls, who actually were following a lot of the Oriental rites, they would do that at the beginning of the ceremonies. Mm-hmm. And so we asked the popes, okay, well, what should I do? Should I kind of follow that, or should I maintain loyalty to Rome? Whatever. And the answer that St. Gregory gave to him was kind of interesting. He comments that, look, ultimately, I'm not going to impose anything. If you find something in some of the Gallic rites that is actually more conducive to the honor of God, and feel free to incorporate that into what you have there in England. But of course, you're more than welcome to maintain the Roman rite. And as Dom Guéranger points out, it shows a great, you might say, latitude in mind of St. Gregory, and certain trust, let's say, in those churches, but at the same time, a certain preference for the Roman rite, and that's actually what will happen, at least in Dom Guéranger's account, and historically, is that the English would, in fact, maintain the Roman rite. They would not really incorporate the Gallic rites for a long time. Yeah, and again, this is in the 600s. An interesting book. I mean, I have no idea how much you're interested in this topic, but it's something that I read recently. It's by Bede the Venerable. St. Bede is, again, another Benedictine monk who lived in the 800s, 700s, or maybe even late 600s. I forget off the top of this. One of those centuries. And he gives us, it's an ecclesiastical history of England, of the English peoples. And it's fascinating because what comes through is precisely kind of what Dom Guéranger talks about, is that profoundly Roman spirit of those original English Catholics, who made a point of following the practices of Rome in many ways. It was great. I mean, it's great. When I was reading that, it's like, dang, this is like, reading like a history of the 1800s, 1900s Catholic bishops. It's amazing.
Yeah, it is interesting because at that time the Pope has no historical precedent really to impose one liturgy upon the rest of the Universal Church, but it doesn't mean that he was without influence. A great number of the churches had wanted to use the Roman rite and saw the Roman rite as the one to go back to.
Right. And we'll get to where they do begin. It's not too long after this, actually, that you do get more of a conscious unification as far as the rites are concerned.
Okay.
And just real quickly to kind of go through some of the reforms that we can draw back to, at least there's good evidence that can be drawn back to St. Gregory. We already kind of mentioned that he gathered together that sacramentary of Gelasius, and he also expunged from it, or got rid of it from it, a lot of prayers that the origin was a bit dubious. So he kind of simplified it, really try to go back to what was truly antique in it. And I've already kind of mentioned the canon. Here, kind of give just a little bit of a comment here. All right. It's kind of interesting, just more, and this is more Roman, but it's something we still have to an extent, and you may have noticed this in your missal, but it seems to be that he was kind of the one who really solidified what we now know as the stational churches. In other words, the churches in Rome that the faithful and often the Pope would go to on a particular feast day or what have you to celebrate the Mass, celebrate the divine mysteries. And he would give sermons there. There's a number of them apparently still extant. So in your missal, like that was one thing I always found really, that was when I first converted, the missal that I had, I think it was a St. Andrew's missal, but they had all the stational churches at the very beginning, that a map of it where they kind of pointed out where those were in the city of Rome. Yeah. And I've always been kind of fascinated by that. And then also, of course, he's very well known for his work in the music of the liturgy, which even now bears his name, the Gregorian chant. And so, he helped to, in many ways, codify it. And he, like I mentioned before, that antiphonary, it's not a word we use really much anymore. But he gathered that and compiled in it a lot of the texts of the music for the different parts of the Mass. And it seems likely that he also composed at least some pieces. But again, he codified it. He really gave it a great clarity. And that's the basis of what we still do now. And Dom Guéranger and I think other liturgists argue to some extent, and I don't know enough about music to really make any judgment here, that especially the Gregorian melody, rhythm, etc., that it has its roots in some of the ancient Greek modes of music. So, to the extent that that would be accurate, we're really seeing that baptism of that natural art into something that's now in the service of the highest activity that man can take part in. Mm-hmm. Even as it is, even if he just made it up whole cloth, it's obviously this huge and work of genius that now we've been still benefiting from 1,500 years later.
Yeah.
So
it is interesting also with the stational churches. I was reading one liturgist who pointed out that was almost that was another reason for it was the sense of unity, that the entire area, the entire diocese is going to kind of travel along with the Holy Father. And so there's so many times and so many symbols that we'll see later in the Mass where unity is a really, really important thing. And unity with the Holy Father in liturgy. And again, I'm skipping way ahead of myself, but this is why it was so painful for the Archbishop to not be in unity with the Holy Father in terms of liturgy, because that's really important. And I don't think traditional Catholics have enough understanding or appreciation of that as we really should.
Oh, yeah. I'd agree with that. Yeah, no, it's... Yeah. That will come out as we come through this. Oh, no, it's not. I like it. No, that will touch on some of the themes that we're going to get almost right into. Well, actually, in a way, that might be a segue into the fact that, okay, so while St. Gregory is performing these reforms in Rome, asking it of Italy, and permitting it to be made use of throughout the rest of the church, especially in the West, it is true that at the time there were a lot of, let's say, distinct rites. So in Spain, you had something that's kind of variously known as the Gothic or the Mozarabic rite, which apparently was composed by St. Isidore of Seville in large measure, plus one or some other bishops, some saints, who helped to compose the order of the prayers and the nature and what the contents of the prayers, etc. You have, as I already mentioned, the Gallican rite, which is variously traced to some of the Oriental liturgies, because again, some of the very first apostles of Gaul were actually from the East, like Saint Irenaeus, who comes from modern day Turkey, and he was sent, if I'm not mistaken, by Saint Polycarp as a missionary, and he ends up in Lyon, and that's where he ends up being a bishop. So obviously his framework is the East, and he's not the only one in that case. And you also have the Ambrosian rite in Milan, again, which has a lot of similarities with the Roman rite, but you do have some significant differences as well. And because of that, and all of these vast areas, you have different ways of approaching the worship of God. Mm-hmm. Now, let's say as things begin to settle after, let's say, the collapse of the Roman Empire in the next couple of hundred years, and you have the buildup of some more stable political structures, you also have, together with that, a continuing growth and an active attempt to nourish that unity in worship. Mm-hmm. Perhaps the first real big, let's say, action in that regard comes through Charlemagne. Well, in fact, maybe we can take a step back. Some of his forefathers. So Pepin, was the son of Charles Martel, is going to, let's say, become invited to work more closely with the Pope in Rome in the mid-700s because of the need to protect the papacy and the church in Rome against the Lombards, which is where the people from whom the modern Lombardy gets its name, so the northern part of Italy. So the Pope at the time, St. Stephen, goes to him, asks his help. He comes, he protects Rome, and while there, begins to be enamored of the Roman way of worshiping God over and above what he has in the Gallic rites. And so what will happen is he first, and then some of his sons, culminating in Charlemagne, are going to invite Rome to send, let's say, representatives to teach the clergy in their domains, so in Gaul and the Frankish kingdoms, precisely the Roman rite, based on what St. Gregory had done, both as far as the order as well as the chant. So Charlemagne in particular will bring in some members of the papal choir, basically, and set them up in different cities to make schools of Gregorian chant. The more famous one, apparently, at least according to Dom Guéranger, was in Metz. And many members of the clergy did, in fact, submit to that, more or less leaving aside what was, in fact, a rite that was licit and legitimate up until that time, in favor of that greater unity with, the mother of all churches, with Rome. Now we'll see that there are some, let's say, nuances to that, of course. But by the time that Charlemagne dies, more or less, so in 814, more or less, the Roman rite is established throughout the empire, the Holy Roman Empire. And at that point in the West, again, according to Dom Guéranger, only the Spaniards would have their own rite proper, outside of this or that pocket, like in Milan, where they had some churches that still had their Ambrosian rite. And even there, in Spain, it's interesting to think, at this point in 814, this is about 100 years after the Muslims have swept through more or less most of Spain and subjugated it to their heresy and to their false ideas about God. And so when we speak of the Spanish church here, it's a very limited reality at this point. It's very much just the northern portion of Spain. Right. Okay. Now, that being said, what's interesting is that while the church in the Holy Roman Empire takes on the Roman rite, at the same time, over the next few hundred years, you're going to have a lot of these, ancestors of the modern French adding a lot in their various areas to the Roman rite. So it's going to stay the Roman rite, but they'll add prayers, add various ceremonies, etc., which in time will actually find their way back to Rome. Okay, so let me just maybe read something from the Catholic Encyclopedia about this. And there they say, so the Roman rites developed from the 9th to the 11th century in this way. So that's 9th century begins with Charlemagne. He dies in 814. So they say that the pure Roman sacramentary sent by Pope Adrian to Charlemagne, was ordered by the king to be used alone throughout the Frankish kingdom. The people were attached to their old use, which was partly Roman, so Gelasian, that Gelasian sacramentary I mentioned at the beginning, and partly Gallican. So when the Gregorian book was copied, they added to it various Frankish supplements. And gradually these supplements became incorporated into the original Roman sacramentary sent into the kingdom. Mm-hmm. So composed, it came back to Rome, again through the influence of these emperors, these Holy Roman emperors, and became the use of the Roman Church. And a certain sacramentary missal at the end of the 11th century, the end of the 1000s, shows the fused rite complete as the only one in use at Rome. Now, what's interesting here is you get a number of things that we kind of assume are, a lot of these liturgists will point out, seem to have come from this kind of mixture that was then adopted and blessed by Rome. So, for example, the Gallican influence, according to some of these men, like Bishop or Balmer, I don't know, it's just Catholic Encyclopedia, I'm quoting them. The influence is noticeable chiefly in the variations for the course of the year. Their view is that St. Gregory had given the Mass a greater uniformity, and to bring it somewhat into the model of the unchanging Eastern liturgies. And its present variety for different days and seasons came back again with the mixed books later. The Gallican influence may also be seen in many dramatic and symbolic ceremonies foreign to the stern and pure Roman rite, such as the blessing of candles, ashes, palms, even much of the Holy Week ritual. So at least their argument is a lot of these, ancillary aspects of the liturgy, a little bit more expressive, were originally not from Rome, but from these kingdoms. But they kind of, once the Roman rite had been imposed, kind of got incorporated in, and then were received back by Rome.
I think almost the entire ceremony of Maundy Thursday in specific, and like the blessing of the Paschal candle and the Paschal ceremony, those, from what I understand, I've got a few of the books back there, are basically Gallican that are now considered Roman, but they weren't Roman originally.
Not originally, although, and here's the interesting part is Rome does have that latitude to make her own. And it goes back, in fact, what St. Gregory is saying, look, if there are things that are worthwhile, that are conducive to the honor of God, by all means, let's incorporate it.
Yeah.
And he does the same thing, again, just stepping back to St. Gregory again, in that letter that I was mentioning that he wrote to St. John, or not St. John, but to John of Sicily, it's a bishop there. He comments so there's this element that was good, let's say in the Oriental Rite, and there's no reason not to do it, even if we modify it a little bit. Like, for example, the Kyrie. He says that the Orientals, when they do the Kyrie, at least at his time, everybody would do it together.
And it was really long. It was really
long.
It was really long, too.
Yeah. Whereas in Rome, they do it alternating between clergy and faithful. It's so there's a unity in some respects, but we do have some modifications. And it's during this period that you have kind of growing up, or will have grow up, a lot of, let's say, more local rites that are oftentimes, Roman at root, and then these amalgamations or these additions. The Sarum rite in England. You have rites apparently in Paris, Rouen, kind of particular to the diocese. And then, of course, a lot of the religious orders would also kind of have a similar development and growth. Although that's a little bit later. So for example, the Dominicans, they will more or less be something of a Gallican rite. Because again, they too, like the Dominicans, if you've ever seen one of their liturgies, they'll begin with the offertory. Mm-hmm. And then leave the oblata, that which has been offered to God, on the altar until the time for the consecration. Now it's in the late 1100s or 12th century, but yes, it's kind of the similar movement. Mm-hmm. The next major effort to, let's say, work in the direction of a greater unity, to spread the Roman rite, actually happens in that 11th century, and it deals with the Mozarabic or the Gothic rite. And so in the latter part of that century, more or less Rome and a number of leading lights in Spain itself decide that we're going to adopt the Roman rite. So you have there's a council in 1063 where a lot of the bishops there present decree that that's the direction they want to move in. And then about 10 years later, you have St. Gregory VII, who really pushes it. And he's pretty harsh, actually, in a way. But he's very, very clear. I want that the Roman rite be adopted and then it become the norm in those lands. And it's interesting. It doesn't quite lead to the destruction of the Mozarabic rite. That does continue, but it's extremely reduced. More or less, you have a few churches in, say, Toledo, which is now where it's most associated with, that continue it before being officially sanctioned by Rome to maintain that, kind of like in Milan. So Milan, Rome will sanction the Ambrosian rite to continue. And in each case, it's partly as a testament to the fact that these liturgies were holy. They're not bad. It's just that there was a higher priority of that unity of faith, ultimately. So as a testament, as a living witness to what was, a few churches are granted the right to make use of them, but for everybody else, they're asked to take on the Roman rite. And that's at this point, like in the mid-1000s, you've now had a large part of their reconquest of north and central Spain. So St. Gregory will work with the kings of Aragon, of Leon and Castile and Galicia, which is a far northern part of Spain. And those kings throw themselves behind these efforts of the Pope.
It is really interesting, like we saw last time with Father Sherry, and we're seeing here with you today. There's not, I mean, there is a separation between the church and state in terms of liturgy, but the temporal leaders play a very big influence in the liturgy that happens in their kingdom. And again, we have to remember that the temporal leaders at the time also, in many cases, had a say in who the bishop was. That's a whole other topic that we'll get to another time, maybe sometime. But
yes, I mean, precisely. In fact, that point is St. Gregory the Seventh, same one we're talking about here, who worked with these kings in Spain. He's also the one, of course, who deposed Henry II, if I'm not mistaken, because of investiture, which is where it looked like, or where the secular authority claimed to give jurisdiction to the bishop of a diocese. And St. Gregory's like, nope, that not happening. Nope. And but you're right.
It is fascinating. This whole period, I mean, again, it's always referred to as the Dark Ages and medieval and all that. I have been, I mean, I'm a nerd like you, Father, and no disrespect because I'm calling it to myself. But I've just been diving into this whole period because, especially from an ecclesiastical standpoint, from a canon law, which kind of didn't exist at that point, it's Wild West, but it's fascinating. It really is interesting.
Yeah. And it's keeping in mind as well that it's precisely at this period of time with medieval ages that you have the beginning of the we might say the golden age of church architecture. The most glorious testaments to the faith, oftentimes are going to be begun in the 1000s, 1100s, like Notre Dame, Chartres, the Basilica in Milan, or the Cathedral of Milan. A lot of those, and again, it's all to obviously enshrine this liturgy that we're talking about. And a lot of the leaders temporally, is a comment actually of Carolingian at various points in that work where he's commenting on the influence, the interactions of the temporal rulers. And he laments the fact that at that time, it's clear that they cared deeply about the liturgy, would take part in it. Some of them even composed hymns or sequences that were used in the liturgy. And he then looks to his own time and the rulers, and he's not favorably impressed by the contrast. Yeah. And it's obviously all the more true in our own day.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that some of these temporal leaders would they would go to the liturgy, or like the whole liturgy in any given day. So the divine office, mass, and stuff like that. One was reproached. I think this was Richard the Lionhearted. I think I forget now the exact exchange. If it was him, it was one of these leaders. He was reproached for not hearing sermons more often. He's like, look, I'd rather spend time with the one my soul loves in actual worship than hear this preacher.
Yeah. Yeah, that is interesting. So you mentioned this a little bit, but the monastic communities are going to have a really big influence as well. The temporal leaders are going to have an influence, obviously the Pope, but the monastic communities, the various orders that are springing up and really flourishing this time, they're going to play a big role in how the liturgy changes or doesn't change, etc.
Oh yeah, no, it's true, and that even as I kind of touch on various tangentially, that goes back really to St. Gregory the Great. He was a Benedictine. St. Augustine was a Benedictine. Even some of the, at this time, you have, when St. Benedict himself wrote his rule, he looked to Rome for guidance in the order of the liturgy, the division of the Psalms and the divine office, etc. And that goes back and forth, and the Benedictines are really the civilizers of Europe and the repositories of the faith and of the liturgy. So they take great care of it. And So not only did they give great leaders to the church, St. Gregory VII also was a Benedictine at the time, but a lot of the practices that kind of originated in the monasteries would find their way into the wider church, because many of them, in addition to like those popes, you have a law of bishops. They've been formed by that monastic way of life, and they would, seeing the wisdom of it, would incorporate certain aspects. So, for example, let's say on Sundays, Dom Guéranger points out that the origin of the asparagus that we have before a sung mass comes from the monasteries, which is, it's meant to prepare people, the souls assisting for what's the worship to come. That's why, when you go to a sung mass on a Sunday, you don't take holy water, because the asparagus takes the place of that. It's always fun when you're dealing with a young guy who forgets that. He dips his hand in and goes back just like, no, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course you tell him that he's being a bad Catholic and a heretic. No, I'm joking.
Exactly.
I'm joking.
Yeah, exactly. You should go to confession before. Well, anyways,
public flogging. Come on.
You also have, let's say, in the divine office, a lot of the Marian hymns at the end of Compline, originate with them. And even certain things like the All Souls Day apparently originated in Cluny, this great monastery, and that gave several popes and a lot of bishops to the church before it kind of fell into decadence. But All Souls Day apparently originated there, then migrated to the wider church. And then such practices like the Vini Creator that said before during Terce in the octave of Pentecost, again, it seems to have originated there. And again, those are just some aspects of it, but we have to keep in mind that in many cases, a lot of the schooling, a lot of the, let's say, treasuring and passing on of traditions happen in the monasteries. So that definitely includes the liturgy as such. Yeah. And also, too, it's not unlikely that there is some play there as far as the question of the development of private masses, what we now know as the low mass. Because up until then, it's, or at least in the early church, and I'm sure Father Sherry commented on this to some extent, it was not unheard of that you'd have concelebration or you'd have the priest together around their bishop. But as time went on, and I think Archbishop Lefebvre comments on this as well, as that deeper appreciation of the theology underlying the sacrifice of the Mass, and the desire to make use of those riches for particular purposes, there was a multiplication of individual masses, and which would not therefore have the same solemnity that you would have when you have the conventual Mass, everyone's gathered around. So you have the full pomp. And that's what leads to the absence of the singing, the absence of the presence of the deacon and subdeacon and what have you. Now I think in many cases, and I think for a lot of us in our context, we view the norm, that which is most common and the what should be happening most often, as the low Mass. But from the church's point of view, it's the exact opposite. That's something that's permitted for the sake of allowing these treasures of the Mass to be more readily available. But realistically, the height of the liturgy, the height of the Mass, is a solemn high Mass or even a pontifical high Mass with the bishop. That's how you give the greatest honor and glory to God.
Mm-hmm. And in reality, the creation of the low Mass is everything in it has as its parent or some sort of a ceremonial function. It all derives from the pontifical Mass, from the papal Mass. All of it, there's a through line for every little thing that the priest does, from the papal Mass going down to the low Mass that you said on a side altar this morning in St. Mary's. I mean, it's all there. Yeah,
no, precisely. And that's why the solemn high Mass, or whatever, however we should, the solemn high Mass, that's the norm. Mm-hmm. And in small detail that I think probably the average faithful can't see, because when the priest goes to the middle of the altar preparing to say the gospel, he'll look up to the cross and he'll bow down and he'll put his hands together, but he won't touch the altar with his hands. Mm-hmm. And the reason he does that is because at that moment he's taking the place of the deacon, who at no point during the Mass is allowed to touch the altar. So he's basically just taking into himself that role. Right. Now, the other thing too that probably is somewhat affected by the monasteries is the daily Mass, or canons and whatnot, where again, it's the intention to magnify the treasures that the church is able to have by allowing a priest to say Mass every day. And Dom Guéranger points out, I guess, at this time when that was becoming more of a practice, it also, that some priests went too far and would say Masses or multiple Masses every day for the sake of getting different stipends or whatever. And so at a certain point, the church is like, no. And outside of, let's say, the need of the faithful, one Mass is sufficient. Now, perhaps to kind of work towards the conclusion of what we want to see, after that period, we have, sorry, just want to make sure I don't miss anything. Oh, yeah. There was a few other things that would happen during the 1300s and, the 1200s and the 1300s, that again will touch us. And part of that, one major thing, relatively speaking, is the introduction of the offertory as we know it. So previously, basically, you had the offertory oremus, and the next part would be the secret prayed over them. Mm-hmm. And then you might have some prayers of private devotion. But as the Catholic Encyclopedia points out, so the present ritual and the prayers said by the celebrant at the offertory were introduced from France about the 13th century. So it's another illustration of that kind of mixture of influence. Before that, the secrets were only the offertory. Before that, the secrets were the only offertory prayers. And there was a considerable variety as to these prayers throughout the Middle Ages until the revised Miss of Pius V, who kind of gave that their final structure. And so elsewhere in the same Catholic Encyclopedia, they comment that in the Middle Ages, as the public presentation of the gifts by the people had disappeared, which is merely they brought it up, then gave it to the deacon, who then would work with the priest, which we still kind of have with the acolytes bringing it up to the deacon. There seemed to be a void at this moment, which was filled by our present offertory prayers. For a long time, these prayers were considered a private devotion of the priest, like the preparation at the foot of the altar. So they were established at Rome by the 14th century, 1300s, and the present Roman prayers are compiled from various sources, Gallic or Mozarabic. And they point out that at least one of them, the Suscipe Sancte Pater, is found in a prayer book of one of these Frankish kings, right after Charlemagne, Charles the Bald, with whom I can now begin to sympathize. So it's there, it's present. It's not like it's new, but it doesn't really get formally incorporated until a little bit later date into the Roman rite. And also at the same time, you have the introduction of the office of Corpus Christi. This is one of these occasions where you have a feast simply created, but of course to express a faith that goes back since the beginning of the church. And at the same time, you begin to have more commonly the elevation of the host and the chalice, that we're familiar with in the Mass, with all the bells that go along with that. But after this period, after but kind of beginning with the 1300s and into the 1400s, you begin to have more and more of a decadence that, at least in the liturgy, is not infrequently tied to the Renaissance, where you kind of have a desire for more elegant diction, more classical references and what have you. And that's introduced a lot of times by, private individuals or individual bishops, what have you. And that unfortunately creates a greater and more pronounced decadence in the liturgy at the time. And to some extent, that you have a reaction against that which Dom Guéranger will ultimately call the anti-liturgical heresy. So partly because they reject certain true things in the liturgy, but also partly just because there is this decadence that seems not very pious that they respond to. So in outside the church, beginning in the church, but then pretty quickly outside the church, as these heretics like Luther will leave, they want to diminish the prayers of the church. They want to diminish the mystery, make it much more simple. And of course, in the vulgar language, a lot of things, like it's interesting reading through, he has a chapter dedicated to the anti-liturgical history, and he goes through like 12 points that he identifies as, elements of it. And so many of them are just fascinatingly similar to what we see with the Novus Ordo, interestingly. I mean, it's just kind of an aside here. His point has nothing to do with the Novus Ordo, of course, because it didn't exist at the time. Right. But it has to do with these Protestants who are wanting to claim to get this greater simplicity in the liturgy. So he says, the first character of the anti-liturgical heresy is a hatred of tradition and the formulas of the divine cult, that they'll want to get rid of. And then that'll manifest itself in replacing the prayers that the church through over time has developed with scripture. So that's what that's what we have to go back to, and that's how we're going to use to pray. And of course, since sometimes that's not sufficient, they'll compose new prayers. You can think of like the hymn, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," that Luther wrote, and the hymnology that you get in a lot of the Protestants. And then anything that expresses mysteries in the worship, a great reduction of, let's say, the bodily movements that reflect that mystery, like genuflections, prayers, kneeling, etc. I mean, it's just fascinating, the chapter. And then he kind of ends that list of things. You get rid of the priesthood, you get rid of the sacred language, you get rid of any kind of prayers that express kind of something above man. It's just fascinating. So they're already dealing with this in the 1500s. Mm-hmm. And again, obviously at the Novus Ordo, that will be seen more. You get that again. So what happens is that in order to respond to that, to the kind of the decadence within the church, that overemphasis on elegance and classical diction, kind of a profane spirit, and the individual spirit, both in the church, and then this heresy from without, you have called the Council of Trent. Well, I mean, it has a lot to do, but in this context, it's going to defend the liturgy.
Right.
And to do so by appealing to the ancient traditions and the legitimate development of it. And you have several popes during that period. So Pius IV, Paul IV, who do a lot of work in Rome as the council is going on. They turn that work over to the council in hopes that they would have an opportunity there to really nail down the reform and codify the liturgy. That does not in the end happen. And so in the last session of the Council of Trent, they turn back that work over to the Pope. And so Pius IV will be the one who then does a lot of that, and Pius V will bring it to his completion. And it's really quite lovely. And so Pius V, in his bull Quo Primum, which is very famous, obviously, but it's worth reading just because of the mindset and how they approach it. He says, "Hence we decided to entrust this work to learned men of our selection. They very carefully collated all their work with the ancient codices in our Vatican library." So all these texts from St. Gregory the Great, from St. Gregory the Seventh, etc., all the popes, all the liturgists who had worked in between then, and with reliable, preserved, or amended codices from elsewhere. Besides this, these men controlled the works of ancient and approved authors, concerning the same sacred rites, and thus they have restored the Missal itself to the original form and rite of the Holy Fathers. And this work has been gone over numerous times and further amended after serious study and reflection. We commanded that the finished product be printed and published as soon as possible, so that all might enjoy the fruits of this labor, and thus priests would know which prayers to use and which rites and ceremonies they were required to observe from now on in the celebration of Masses. So it's quite beautiful. And of course, as is well known, he commands everybody in the Western Church to take on this rite, which at this point is not a novelty, as we've already seen. There's already been a lot of work prior to that to make the Roman Rite the Mass of the Western Church. So what he's simply doing here is, okay, look, everyone admits in principle that this should be the case. There's been a lot of mistakes. There's been a lot of changes, a lot of local variations. So everyone has to use this missal, which is definitive and normative for the whole church. And again, it's not like it's just this new thing. And it's the exact opposite of what happened with Paul VI, where you have the direct opposite movement, which is to take this work towards unity and blow it up.
Right.
Right. And he gives the permission for those rituals or those missals, rites that have existed for 200 years or longer to continue, which leads so that's where the Mozarabic still survives, the Ambrosian Rite, the Dominican Rite still survives. But everything else, all the other variations have to cease and give way to this new missal, or actually this ancient missal. Now, and maybe just by way of conclusion.
Can I ask a question? And maybe this is a much bigger question than we have time for in this episode, Father, because I know you're about to wrap up, but I'm not trying to lead you anywhere. I'm genuinely just asking the question.
Yeah.
Before the Council of Trent, there were multiple variations of the Mass. And it might take me a minute to try to explain my thoughts because I'm jumbled all over here.
Yeah, sure.
That's not bad. And it wasn't bad then, and we can't say it's bad now. So in principle, it's not bad to have multiple rites within the church. We see that with the Ambrosian Rite, Mozarabic Rite, etc. That's a good thing. And I would say it even adds to the richness of the church. Pope St. Pius V comes in and says, that's a good, but the greater good is to get rid of this heresy and make everything just watertight to make sure that there's because the Protestant heresy and all that stuff that was going on then was so bad, we have to protect it. And so he locked it down. Would it be fair to say that he did something that was, I don't want to say bad because it wasn't bad, but less, would you say it is more generally beneficial to the church to have multiple rites, and the way things were going then was okay? And if not for the Protestant crisis, that we would have multiple rites, and that's not necessarily a bad thing? I guess I'm just broadly saying, because for the last 500 years, Catholics have been used to the idea that the Pope is the supreme arbiter of all worship, of all liturgy, period. But that's not necessarily the case.
Well, it is. At the highest level,
it is because he said so, but.
Well, no, by office and by right. No, it's,
Fair.
It's not merely something that he's, let's say, arrogating to himself. And, in a certain sense, there is a greater dramatic character to St. Pius V's action insofar as it's in the context of this great revolt against the church. He's the same Pope who will excommunicate good Queen Bess and, alleviate all Catholic subjects from their duty of allegiance to her. But fundamentally, his principle is the same as a lot of his predecessors, like we were seeing with St. Gregory VII. He did the same thing. He basically worked. He didn't simply originate the movement to, let's say, impose the Roman Rite in Spain and basically to eliminate, for all practical purposes, the Mozarabic Rite. But he certainly was very strong on it, and for the simple reason, and for the sake of the unity of the faith. It's so in fact, to quote, I mean, in this light, it kind of leads into what I wanted to quote here. You have in a very early council in the Frankish Church, the Church of the Gauls, where they say, because we don't have only one faith, let us also have only one rule for the divine offices. The idea there being the chief thing that matters is the unity of faith. And that not infrequently is deeply fostered and facilitated by that sameness of addressing God as Father. It doesn't mean that you have to have an absolute uniformity. Clearly not. Right. Clearly not, because the church has certainly, and especially it's all the more clear in the Eastern rites, where you do have still a lot of different rites, the Byzantine, the Rome. I guess, one thing I didn't mention there, and partly because we weren't looking at the Eastern rites, you do have the Slavonic rite, which is devised, and which is, commissioned by Rome with the missionaries St. Cyril and Methodius, who go to Russia, and it's slightly different, and that's blessed. So it's not as though you have to have an absolute and utter uniformity, but when there's a temper that allows, there's a great good that comes from, the simple reality that, if you go, at this time, you go to France, you go to England, you go to any other country where the faith is practiced, you are able to go to Mass.
You know what's going on. Yeah.
And unite yourself with everyone there and be just like them, comfortable with what's going on for the most part, maybe one or two, local customs that they may have. And that greater work, I think, is very valuable. This is precisely Dom Guéranger, as one of his purposes in doing things like the liturgical year, is to try to foster, to not allow that unity to be lost in France. Because again, he's writing just after the French Revolution. There's been a huge upheaval, and there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of turmoil there. So he's trying to lead back. Okay, look, this is where we will find our stability, and have that purity of faith.
I guess the broader point that I'm getting to is when we see, obviously the new Mass is very much a sit down and figure it out, and it's an innovation in so many ways. But when we see things like, and again, I'm not trying to be an apologist for the new Mass. Do not come at me, people. But you see things like the children's Mass, and then Mass, and different versions of the new Mass that the priest can choose from. Those have their problems, to be sure, but the traditional movement or traditional Catholics or and again, I'm putting words in your mouth, Father, correct me if I'm wrong, but the main opposition to the new Mass is about many different things, but not about necessarily the variations that are available. That's
sort of normal
in the history of the church.
To some extent, yeah. I mean, obviously here, what's very abnormal is just they're, kind of composed whole cloth by, guys, to kind of caricature something, a bunch of guys in a smoke-filled room, an incense-filled room. Exactly. Got rid of a lot of the incense. No, I mean, so you go to a Maronite rite Mass is going to be very different. As you listen to the Arabic, and it's just a different order of the prayers and content of the prayers. Yeah, that in itself is not the issue. The issue, of course, and again, fundamentally it's already been indicated, is the question of faith. The problem with the Novus Ordo Mass is fundamentally one of faith. And the fact of a greater variety, that's a sign, we may say, of the decomposition of the spirit of the faith in our circumstances. Now that there'd been St. Pius V says in his bull, Quo Primum, this canon, this Mass, is guaranteed to transmit holiness. So actually, no, that's the Council of Trent that I'm quoting, or paraphrasing, I should say. And there, they make it clear that, it cannot be questioned that it is holy, that it is salutary, and as a consequence, something that any priest any faithful can appeal to. So this is chapter 4 in the 22nd session. And whereas it beseemeth that holy things be administered in a holy manner, and all things of all holy things, this sacrifice is the most holy, to the end that it may be worthily and reverently offered and received, the Catholic Church instituted many years ago the sacred canon, so pure from every error that nothing is contained therein which does not in the highest degree savor of a certain holiness and piety, and raise up unto God the minds of those that offer. For it is composed out of the very words of the Lord, the traditions of the apostles, and the pious institutions also of holy pontiffs, such as St. Gregory the Great. And as we mentioned, he was one of the last to enter in some of the prayers in that canon. And it's there that's what the issue is. He's guaranteed to foster this piety, this sense of the faith, which you can't guarantee at this point. In fact, quite frankly, can show that it's positively noxious to the faith in the Novus Ordo.
Yeah, it is fascinating. They weren't saying you can't ever touch this period, because again, there were some changes made from the time when Quo Primum was written, and it sounds very severe. You must not under wrath of Saints Peter and Paul, I believe it says, you shall not, don't mess with this. But John the 23rd did. He inserted, I believe, St. Joseph into the canon, or was it Pius XII? I don't recall.
No, it was John the 23rd who did that. Yep.
That's the missal that you say every morning, Father. So, obviously it can be changed. He wasn't saying that. He was saying printers don't mess with this. And also, if you need a golden standard to go back to, this is it. Here, I got you. Now you can go ahead and make changes carefully as you need.
And that might be a good place in a way to end, because that's precisely what Archbishop Lefebvre said about when he liked to call it the Mass of all times as opposed to the Tridentine Mass or the Mass of St. Pius V. He commented that, what St. Pius V was not to drop anything new fundamentally, as he said, we went back, really dived into the most authentic versions, and this is what we have, and this is what we're going to use. But what he did do is rather to canonize the Mass in that rite. It's not to make it up. He's merely assuring that this is indeed holy. And no one can at that point say it's not holy. Or, as the document says, no one can say the Mass in that rite according to those rubrics.
Yeah. It is really fascinating. Father, thank you for letting me geek out with you a little bit. I jumped in more than I usually do, but you can tell I love this. I love this topic, and I love this period of history.
Clearly, I'm impressed.
But anyway, I think we were going to be having you on here in about another 10 episodes or so, and we'll be talking about the offertory with you, but that's when we get into the parts of the Mass.
Oh, that's good to know.
So heads up, you're on deck. No, that's going to be like December, maybe January. So you got time. Father, thank you so much for your time and your preparation. It was great to have you.
As always, it's a pleasure. You.